Online multiplayer games are obviously not a recent invention. The earliest commercial online games date back to the 80s, and they've changed a lot since then. But recently, with the wider availability of high-speed internet, online games have become an absolute powerhouse presence, taking up a significant portion of the industry's revenue. One would think that online games have since solved some of its bigger issues, but sadly, that's not the case. Now, obviously, there's a ton of factors to consider when discussing the potential longevity of an online game. There's content, the user experience, art direction, how it's monetized, and even how the publisher might measure the success of the game. I'll touch on those near the end of the video, but I want to focus on two specific discussion points that seem to have become more important than ever, as more and more players begin to gain a greater perspective on things. And those points are the ability to play offline and the competitive experience. The combination of these two aspects of an online game hold a ton of power over how long it'll take before it fades into obscurity. And in the case of offline availability, it could affect the game's crucial first few months. So let's start off by talking about that first. It's always exciting when a promising new online game is announced, especially when it's a sequel to something already popular. But it also never fails to be deflating when you hear that it requires a constant internet connection to even be playable, including when you're playing by yourself. That single piece of information can almost tank a game's pre-release hype, depending on the game. Some people might respond to that with, well, it's an online game, so that should be expected, right? Or, it's 2023, we all have internet connections, what's the issue? Well, there's a few issues with it. Mostly basic usability problems. For example, what if my internet is down for an unknown amount of time, but I want to play the game? Or, what if I lose connection mid-game and I lose all my progress? Diablo 4 is always online, and for those who don't know, hardcore mode has permadeath, meaning that if your character dies in that mode, it's gone forever. Immediately after launch, there were already numerous reports of people losing their hardcore characters, including the first player to hit level 100 on hardcore, who died because he accidentally disconnected in the middle of a fight. Diablo 4 is designed to treat purposeful disconnects as a death in order to prevent people from saving their hardcore characters when they know they're going to die. But this was not purposeful. That's 80 hours of playtime wasted over a disconnect he had no control over. Blizzard has already announced that they'll be adding a safety net in the form of an item that automatically teleports a character out of harm's way if the game senses a disconnect. But it's still going to be useless in cases where the server side of the game does not get notified of the disconnect until after the character dies, meaning the item could still end up not helping in many disconnect cases. And even beyond all that, the always online requirement has one huge implication in the long term. What happens to the game's availability and functions when these servers inevitably go offline? Some of the longest running and most popular online games have an inconceivable amount of content released for them. But what happens when the day comes that they finally shut things down? Generally speaking, it's way too much to expect the publisher to simply hand the game over to the players and let them run it themselves. But for quite a few MMOs, the publishers do turn their backs and quietly allow the players to run their own servers. But not every game is going to have this option available to them, particularly games that rely on servers for many basic functions. So what becomes of them? As sad as it is, those games and the millions or even billions of playtime hours the community has put into them simply disappear. This is especially true for games that might have been on consoles only, and there were several fairly prominent ones. The PlayStation 3 on its own had Warhawk, Starhawk, Mag, SOCOM Confrontation, and Dust 514. I've personally played 3 out of these 5 games, and I would totally be interested in checking them out again, if I could. But for most, I can't. As far as I can tell, Warhawk is the only one with private servers available, but it still requires owning a functioning PS3 and a physical copy of the game, because according to the compatibility page for RPCS3, Warhawk does not function at a sufficient level for good emulation. Otherwise, the only thing to show for these games' existence after they shut down is whatever gameplay videos might be left on YouTube for future generations to see out of curiosity. And even sadder than that is that some games do not take a decade or more to reach that point. As of 2023, there's such an incredible amount of online game saturation that even some genuinely good games might meet an untimely demise in less than 2 years. In the case of Rumbleverse, which was a promising battle royale with a melee focus inspired by wrestling and fighting games, it was less than 7 months. Despite having a really solid concept and gameplay and content that could have easily had more added to it as time went on, it died so quickly that Epic offered refunds on all in-game purchases. And now, the only way to play Rumbleverse is to go back and watch streamers try it on their own VOD archives. However, on the total opposite side of things, you have Knockout City, the team-based dodgeball game that at least managed to hit 2 years of life before it closed down. But the big thing that sets it apart from Rumbleverse is that Knockout City has released a private server edition, allowing people to still download and play the game for free and host their own invite-only servers, even after the game's official demise. In this way, the most loyal players, however many or however few they may be, can still continue to enjoy the game in a capacity that's sanctioned by the creators of the game. And on PC at that, which is the best platform for this kind of thing. In comparison to the aforementioned Warhawk's case, needing to own a 17-year-old console is not the most accessible way to keep a game alive, which is all the more tragic because it's probably the only way it's feasible for that specific game. This is why I support Sony releasing their future live service games on PC too. It makes the potential for fan-run servers after closure that much greater, whether it happens 6 months after launch or a decade. Now, moving on from the long-term availability problems, let's zoom in to the competitive experience that begins once the game actually starts. This actually encompasses a couple of things, but I'm going to start with one and lead to the other. Let's begin with the meta game. For those who don't understand the term, the meta of a game is the strongest and most effective strategy, character, or loadout that players can use in a specific game to achieve the most success. Acquiring the meta strategy or loadout depends entirely on the game. In the case of something like fighting games, the closest to a meta would simply be maining the character that the community considers to be the strongest. In something like Call of Duty, you might need to put some initial work in to unlock the right weapons, parts, and perks to equip first. Then you acquire the meta by making the right combination of those things. Basically, the meta is the easiest way to victory. Now, I am not against playing the meta. There's nothing inherently wrong with taking advantage of the strongest tools the game offers to achieve victory. But I also subscribe to the notion that you don't always have to play the meta because, typically, the gap between a meta and non-meta player can be closed if the non-meta player is skilled enough. However, this assumes that the game has enough of a semblance of balance that allows non-meta strategies to still be viable against meta players to begin with. And sadly, not all games are like this. It's totally fine for a game to have a meta. It's not fine for that meta to be so ridiculously strong that non-meta players might as well not exist. The issue with an overwhelming meta is not the players taking advantage of it. It's developers ignoring the problems it can cause, namely the shrinkage in viable strategies. If you start up a new first-person shooter with a lot of customization, only to find out that a small pool of about 5% or less of the equipment available to you will actually get you wins, unless you have the reflexes and aim of a robot, it feels like all this customization fails to serve their purpose. It's one thing if the meta is fun to play, but it's another if it's not fun to play against. No one wants to start playing a game and try out non-meta strategies, only to find that they will end up being fodder for meta players unless they also become a meta player. Again, the existence of a meta is not a bad thing. It's okay for a game to have a meta. In fact, there's room to argue that a perfectly balanced game would be boring. But developers need to be extremely careful with letting a meta run wild, because if it becomes too absurdly powerful, there will be no practical purpose to play any other way, and this could very easily drive casual players to abandon the game out of frustration, and eventually, even the competitive meta players themselves will leave because they're tired of fighting the same pool of people over and over and over. The meta issue is only one aspect of the worst parts of the online experience, though. The other aspect that works in tandem with it is matchmaking. The modern-day matchmaking system that many PvP games have adopted is a mixed bag. And that's probably putting it very lightly, depending on the game. The two primary methods of matchmaking players is either completely randomly or based on skill. Truly random matchmaking may sound like the ultimate impartial solution, but it really isn't. It's far too easy to experience extreme situations under this method. In a completely random match-made game, you could easily run into the problem of a very one-sided match. Either your team is utterly dominating to the point where the challenge is non-existent, or you're the one being dominated and it feels like you're not being allowed to play at all. And then there's skill-based matchmaking, which I would definitely say is the preferable of the two. But the mere mention of it is always met with backlash. Not because it's a bad idea, but because an unfortunately vocal chunk of the community reveals themselves to be very selfish players. Unsurprisingly, a lot of meta players do not actually want to play against other meta players. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people of above-average skill simply want to waltz into a game and stomp on people obviously worse than them. The only issues with skill-based matchmaking depends entirely on how it's implemented. Bad skill-based matchmaking might swing from one extreme to the other every several games, which can be annoying. But good skill-based matchmaking allows for fun games at every skill level. The casual players who want to stay alive long enough to see some action and have no interest in playing the meta can mind their own business and still have fun. And the hardcore players who contemplate jumping off a bridge if they end a game with a KD ratio of less than 1 can all play together too. Overall, it would be a net positive for the community, much to the chagrin of habitual pub stompers. In fact, in games that involve single players going head-to-head, such as fighting games, skill-based matchmaking is the only way to go, and for the most part, the entire genre has been functioning just fine with it. But even then, good matchmaking still doesn't necessarily allow for the cultivation of a sub-community within the game. Some of the best online games with the greatest longevity allow for a little something called custom servers. There are games that support custom servers now, yes, but at the AAA game level, the practice seems much more scarce than it was about 18 to 20 years ago. Very few things beat the feeling of starting a new online game, looking over the server list, and finding a populated server that has the exact rule set and map rotation that you love playing with. That's the kind of shit that makes me stick with the game for weeks or months on end. And furthermore, if the server has reliable administrators and moderators, players with bad attitudes get the boot quick. It stands to reason that if you find an active server with your ideal rule set and maps, especially if it's a rare combination, you're more likely to be on your best behavior so you don't lose access. Otherwise, the search for a new home server begins all over again. Granted, this may be the bias of a gamer over 30, but I would really like to see more dedicated servers in AAA games, especially shooters that do not currently have them. They would be an excellent alternative for players who don't want to stick to the same playlist they see every week or two in rotation. And even beyond all these things I've talked about, beyond offline availability, the metagame, and matchmaking, there's still several other factors to take into consideration regarding the lifespan of an online game, such as the amount of content offered on day one, user-friendliness, the presence of unique ideas and how they're implemented, the art direction, mass appeal, how the publishers themselves measure the game's success. And one last thing that some companies might take for granted, luck. You can release a great game at a bad time and it will bomb. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Among Us first released at a bad time and saw meager player counts, but it was extremely lucky to receive a massive resurgence in popularity a couple years later when some big streamers caught on to how fun it was. From a design standpoint, there's ideas about how certain maps or environments lend themselves more towards specific types of gameplay. For example, if you want a game that has a lot of indoor action instead of outdoor, or just tight, closed-off areas in general, you might be better off making the combat focused on guns instead of melee. There's also the argument of free-to-play versus pay-to-play, or how important it may be to rely on existing intellectual properties to build up interest for a strong launch. Multiverses, the platform fighting game full of Warner Bros. Owned characters, seemed like it had everything possible going for it. It had the recognizable faces, it had a solid gameplay foundation, it was free to play, and it was super easy to just start up the game and enter a match. But none of those things prevented a dramatic drop in concurrent players after only a few months. Granted, this drop is not that uncommon in the fighting game space, and it was technically the beta in which this happened, and the full release is still set to launch eventually. But who's to say that it will or won't follow the same trajectory? And even after all that, we don't know what numbers the game needs for WB themselves to consider the game a success. It could be unreasonably high or shockingly low. Going back to Rumbleverse, that game also had a ton of hype on its side. Content creators seemed to enjoy it, and it was also free to play, and it had a healthy amount of customization for your player character. But it still couldn't stop that telltale drop in player activity, and sooner rather than later, it was shut down by Epic. Now, was it because it was a failure by all objective metrics, or was it a failure simply because Epic might have been comparing it to the almost inconceivable success of Fortnite? Who knows? And to make things even more confusing on top of all this, I feel like every time I look in the direction of successful online games, their communities are constantly pissed off about something, but the game somehow continues to thrive in spite of that frustration. As time has gone on, it feels like it's become harder to figure out what a successful online game looks like, instead of easier. In a lot of cases, it seems like any particular game's failure or success was purely circumstantial. It seems like the big games manage to stay big, but the new games struggle to even find their footing unless they manage to get very lucky somehow. Maybe, somewhere in there, is the ideal combination of factors that developers can one day replicate. But as of right now, it's kinda hard to gauge what it is. Does it truly boil down to just having the money to brute force through the lows? If so, that's a pretty dire situation for this entire sector of the industry to be in, as it suggests that anything less than a AAA blockbuster is doomed to an untimely fate, unless it is supremely lucky in some big way. This concludes my thoughts on the lifespan of an online game. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.